a good start, to start with applause, huh? So we are here at stage 3 with our third session, and it is about data and international development, and how even the best of intentions can pave the road to surveillance. And both ladies over here are Zara Rahman from UK and Becky Kazansky from New York. And I'm very happy to have them here on stage 3. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to your session. So, and I think you do also. Okay, thank you.
Can we have the second microphone? Never mind. Hello? Yeah.
Mistakes! I'm sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Right, just checking. So yeah, my name's Zara and we're going to be talking about data in international development, how even the best of intentions can pave the road to surveillance. So we kind of started with this premise, information is a more effective tool in the hands of the strong than in the hands of the weak. So in the case of international development, that's the weak, the vulnerable communities from the poorest regions of the world, the strong being the rich countries that are carrying out the international development projects. So how we came to this, I work in open development, so that's kind of between the open movement and international development. I worked for the Open Knowledge Foundation in development initiatives, and earlier this year I went to the international steering meeting of the global standard around aid transparency called the International Aid Transparency Initiative. And throughout the 3 days I was amazed that these are the people who set the standard for how rich governments should be publishing their aid data, so how they're giving money to poorer countries. And throughout the whole 3 days, there was one panel on privacy and ethics. And I asked a few people about this, like, why aren't we talking about the kind of risks that could be coming from this? And most people's response was, that's not our problem to deal with. That's not what we should be talking about. We should be opening up data and making sure it's all available for people to deal with. And that was kind of flagged up in my head as a potential risk.
And my name is Becky, and in my work I mostly focus on privacy issues as they relate to all of the other issues in the world, which include development. And recently we have noticed that there's been a lot of great conversation and brainstorming within the development field that has begun to ask fundamental questions about the ethics of data collection, data which we all need for various purposes. How can it be misused? How does it open up roads to unintended consequences? And for me, this work becomes meaningful when we assess it within an important area of work like this. So I guess we should start with this fundamental question, which we often take for granted in this day and age. We often assume that more information is better. On the other hand, data and information are not exactly the same thing. Data is the raw things that we collect through various devices and processes, and information is meaningful things that we use to glean insights and do our work. And it seems like we should still ask this fundamental question, why are we collecting data in the first place? And if we are talking about data collection, maybe we should start by establishing this overall framework, which we can call the data life cycle. The first part of this life cycle begins with collection. So this is collection takes place in a number of various ways. It can be because a researcher is out in the field and they are doing primary field work. It can happen through the passive collection from devices of people who don't even know that it's happening to them. It happens through all sorts of different kinds of capacity building work out in the field. Processing refers to what happens to the data once it has been collected initially. And so this includes basically anything that happens from the point that this data enters a database. Does it stay in the database? Does it get analyzed and correlated with other databases? Does this data then get passed on to third parties? And finally, dissemination. This is the sharing of the data. So those third parties? How are they using the data? And as you open up this life cycle to further uses, what could possibly happen down the line?
So some of the ways in which data is collected in international development include to deliver services more efficiently to vulnerable communities. So you can see this clearly in, for example, refugee camps. It helps a lot to know how many people are there, what their needs are, how many are coming in, and patterns that are emerging around that. So increasingly, there are transparency and accountability requirements and laws and regulations in donor countries, such as the Aid Transparency Initiative that I mentioned earlier. And again, increasingly, big data that is becoming quite a buzzword within development. And there's things such as, for example, climate change analysis, various development issues that are trying to be addressed by analysing huge amounts of data.
So as we're coming through this life cycle of data, we ask how are things currently being handled on the ground by various groups, whether it's NGOs, large aid agencies, governments, anyone who's working on the ground. We come to a number of different questions from there. Currently, it seems like many recipients of aid projects can often be portrayed as passive data subjects. Data subject is a term within the EU framework for data protection. It sort of alludes to this relationship where you become data through some process outside of yourself, outside of your own agency, perhaps. And this can in some ways perpetuate the traditional relationship in aid where you have a recipient and then the organization that is bestowing services upon the recipient. So in all of these situations, consent, there's no clear guideline for what it means to say, yes, you can take this data, you can take a picture of me, you can record this fundamental information about me. In some cases, data is implicit. In some cases, it's explicit. In some cases, it's continued active consent. In other cases, there was no consent whatsoever, but then it was applied somewhere down the line in a donor's report that they did, in fact, obtain consent. So privacy rights, there is no universal framework. Yes, the UN has enshrined privacy as a human right. On the other hand, the way that privacy is interpreted is highly contextual and varies from both by geography as well as other types of context. Finally, this is a bit more fundamental. So data and privacy are fairly difficult sets of issues to understand for anyone. And if you look at the whole world, there's still a fairly small privileged group that does have all of the knowledge and skills required to make them informed decision makers about data. And so basically we would say that there is still a fairly broad lack of knowledge about how data and privacy work together or don't.
So just to kind of contextualize this a bit, when we talk about international development, we're broadly talking about efforts made in the world to alleviate poverty. And inequality, and generally this is measured through economic indicators such as GDP per head, per capita, or social indicators such as inequality. So when we're talking through all this, this is international development efforts that are, in theory, have this primary aim, but as we'll see, sometimes they don't always do that very well. In international development, as Becky mentioned earlier, there's in the way that development's been carried out traditionally, there's this kind of quite strong hierarchy of rich countries or development actors coming to a community, a poorer community, and they are the beneficiaries of aid. So it's a very one-way flow of resources, of money, of knowledge, as far as things have been going. And this kind of relates to the way that Becky was talking about the data subject. So not only are they the data subject, they're also the aid subject, or the aid beneficiary, as we call it, in international development. An example of this is a really good example of this can be seen from a project that was carried out in 2002, between 2002 and 2006, called the Listening Project, and it involved a group of people traveling around the world to over 20 aid recipient countries, just listening to people who had been on the receiving side of aid. They weren't doing it with a motive. They didn't have to collect things to satisfy funders or to measure impact or anything like that. It was just the first project where that kind of thing has happened. And they talked to over 6,000 people who've received international assistance. And one of the main themes that I got from this book was that people were telling stories of aid agencies that came to the area, asked lots of questions, and then disappeared. This was clearly the aid beneficiaries becoming data subjects, and then they were trusting the people who came to their communities, who in some cases promised them that projects would take place, that their lives would get better in certain ways, and then they disappeared. Or they came and they took photos, and then they saw these photos on the front pages of international organizations' reports a year later. And this is just one example of that. Within international development, data is largely used within the ICT4D movement, Information and Communication Technologies for Development. And there's lots and lots and lots of examples of this, just a few there. Mobile technologies, banking, getting health advice from other countries, from doctors that are far away, civic mapping, so sending in information about your community via text message to a standard platform like Ushahidi, for example. Delivery of services via biometrics, data collection, that's one we'll be going into a bit more later. And as we mentioned already, big data analysis on development issues. So big data, as already kind of mentioned, it's very generalized. It's an imprecise term referring to large data sets in data science. So the international development over the past 15 years has been largely framed around the Millennium Development Goals, which have 2015 as their target year. So at the moment, lots of people are talking about the what's going to happen post 2015. What will the new goals be? And there's recently been a UN panel that focuses on the data revolution, and there's lots of talk around the post 2015 data revolution.
So this term big data is something we've probably heard a bit too many times at this point, but if we were to try to give it a definition, it's basically the collection of lots and lots of sets of data pieces that are then aggregated and correlated, often with the goal of gleaning particular patterns from this new, amazing, exciting amount of information that wouldn't have been possible in a different day and age without these technologies that we have now. And so there's a lot of excitement and interest around this idea that we can now not only determine patterns based on what we have now, but actually make predictions. And therefore, this has spawned this field of predictive analytics. And predictive analytics does definitely hold some interesting promise. There is a UN body that focuses on this issue. It's called UN Global Pulse, and the idea is that if they can collect and use some of the data that they already have together, they could prevent certain crises in the future. They could predict what the effects of a drought might be in a certain geographic area. They can do pretty important work with this if they figure out how to glean insights from this new mass of data. So not just the UN is interested in this possibility, there's lots of other agents in the field that are involved in taking this promise of more data and seeing what it can be applied to. Palantir is just one company, for example, whose premise is that with the use of this aggregated and correlated data, they can build a more resilient and secure society. This is something that they repeat many times. And so one area, for example, that they're very active in is in human trafficking. And we will talk more about human trafficking later in the talk. If we're talking about principles that can carry across all of these projects, do no harm is one that comes up over and over again. It's this premise that not only is it enough to think about how you can mitigate harms once you're out in the field and carrying out a program, it's it requires you to think through all of this before you actually go out into the field. So basically taking all of the considerations of what it means to work with a marginalized population that has very vulnerable forms of data being put through different systems, and really ask what it would require to use this data ethically. And this goes beyond simple digital security or collection practices. It's a bit larger than that. I already alluded to the problematic nature of consent in all of this work. But basically, there are many different levels of consent, and I would argue that almost no one who uses the internet these days is ever really expressing substantive active consent. We all know consent as a little checkbox that you click at the bottom of a service before you decide to use it, and then from that point forward, whatever happens to your data, you leave to the fates or to the company, or hopefully to a body of law that will then take that and make sure that it is being used appropriately. But in any case, in many of these cases that we discuss, there may be no notion of consent at all, or it'll be implicit.
So one area that is seeing a lot of data use at the moment is biometrics.
So biometrics are generally a technology that allows for greater precision in verification than was ever before possible. This is the premise. And we do that by collecting iris scans or thumbprints. And this is being used in many different parts of the world, both in the global south and areas where development agencies are very active, as well as in the north and societies where we would think that such invasive forms of identification aren't necessary.
So this is just an example. The UNHCR is the UN body that deals with refugees, and they're very, very active on social media. So I saw this in January, and I was a little bit shocked that they were using it on 590,000 refugees. But this was actually really welcomed on Twitter, and people retweeted it and said, "Congratulations, that's awesome news that you're collecting so much data on refugees." And it's true that in lots of cases it does enable more efficient delivery of services, and one of these cases is in Jordan. So when Syrian refugees initially crossed over to Jordan, when they were crossing into refugee camps, they were asked to give up their identity documents, like paper documents, to show that they had registered in the camp. And as the number of refugees continued, the filing system in the refugee camp was completely overwhelmed. And it meant that there were 180,000 documents belonging to members of more than 76,000 families held at this refugee camp, which is a huge number. And it took 50 staff members months and months to make sure it was sorted through and accurately managed and then given back to the right people. So now what they do is when the Syrian refugees get to the refugee camp, their iris scans are taken. And with that, they are given access to food, to water, to free healthcare, and they can even access cash at the ATM in the refugee camp. So they just stand, their iris is scanned, and they get the cash that they are entitled to. And this is great because it avoids risk of theft of their documents. It means if they left their houses if they have to leave things in a hurry, they don't have to rely on paper documents that could be lost. It reduces fraud. It helped in a lot of ways.
On the other hand, of course, a pretty interesting moment in this is that not only are the biometrics being used for verification and identification within the camp, but now there's this great service available where the refugee can go and take out money, which in a way is empowering for that individual. On the other hand, an interesting transfer of data took place between the primary holder and now this bank. And so you have now opened up a whole new road to third-party consequences, which are not written out anywhere and are not kept track of in any sort of accountable manner. So
lots of refugees themselves are, at least on social media, being touted as seeing this as a very positive move. They're identifying their own identity with the fact that they are registered in a global body such as the UN. At least I have an identity now, I exist, which is slightly worrying.
So the biometrics example that was described now was simply using irises as a form of identification and verification. But there are actually a lot of new systems that are being experimented on constantly, which bring more and more information into one place for this biometric form of identification. And so increasingly what we're going to see is trying to store not just thumbprints, for example, but combining the thumbprints with the iris, combining it with credit card information. And so what we see on the right now is something that's called a smart card, and that is bringing together all these types of data into one place, which once again, this is framed as being new, enhanced, and actually more secure, therefore in some ways more enabling for people in terms of how they are identified and how they make their way through society. And actually, what has really struck me about this new development is the way that it is framed as being privacy and privacy enhancing, not just a new form of securing, but a way to get beyond what is seen in some circles as this problematic zero-sum debate. This debate is, so should our society have surveillance and data collection? And it's imagined that on one side you have people saying, no, we should have no surveillance. And on the other side you have law enforcement and government agencies who say, yeah, actually we need all of the surveillance we could possibly ever imagine and more in order to create a secure society, in order to deal with all of the threats that we face on an everyday level. And so traditionally there has been this framework called privacy by design, which many people are, well, not many, but many more people are familiar with than other obscure frameworks for how to handle privacy within systems. And privacy by design takes as its basis this idea that privacy needs to be built in from the beginning in a system that involves both people and technology. And on the one hand, privacy by design has been very valuable and has been there for 20 years as a reference point. But now, in some cases, biometric smart cards are said to be in line with this framework because they are allowing a middle way that doesn't ask us to choose between either more surveillance or less surveillance. They say that with this system of enhanced verification and enhanced collection of data, we are also securing it in a way that wasn't possible before, and therefore we are protecting it. Therefore, the data protection that is enabled through this makes it an adequate and ethical choice. So this is what I just described. This concept of getting beyond either more surveillance or less surveillance is called full functionality. So let's make everyone happy with one system. And there are a lot of important things that are attempted with this decision to try to bridge between the privacy camp and the national security camp. But on the other hand, in my opinion, there's an elephant in the room that doesn't get addressed, which is we actually need data minimization. If we're always arguing that with more protection around the data we keep, then that's going to be great as long as we can protect and collect at the same time. On the other hand, that means we're never talking about the fact that we shouldn't actually necessarily collect all of that to begin with.
So one area in which surveillance could be seen as taking place is the mobile ICT4D movement that happens. There's lots of real-world examples around this. You do.
So yes, a research survey was done on mobile AIDS platform users, which reported that a fifth, or 18% of participants, reported that someone else had inadvertently received their SMS containing AIDS or HIV information. This is just one example. Then there are examples where a government will come in and ask for this information. and they now have a perfect, simple, easy place to go to get it because another body, either a mapping project or a small NGO, has collected it already. So the types of data that gets collected in mobile ICT4D can include something directly from the user and the device that they're using, so their phone. This can be their name, their address, their date of birth, the IMEI or the UDID, information gathered about their behavior, such as location data, web browsing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on about what can be collected.
So one way in which mobile ICT4D takes place is through participatory mapping. And one example of this has been through the platform Ushahidi and lots of others, but basically crowd mapping. So people can send in reports via SMS to a centralized platform, and it enables other people to see what's going on in that community. So the first major use of the Ushahidi project for crisis mapping was back in 2010 after the Haiti earthquake. So this was a kind of volunteer-driven effort to produce this map that showed what was going on, where people were being found, what was happening. And it happened with a group called Mission 4636, which was set up as the number 4636 was set up as an emergency number to text if you wanted to send in a report to the Haiti project. So they have received over 10,000 messages just during the search and response period of trying to find people during the earthquake. And there was an independent evaluation that took place afterwards because it was a really big deal in the crowd mapping world. And so during the project, during the earthquake, the search itself, the decision was taken after 24 hours of deliberation, consultations with lawyers, whether or not to publish the SMSs that were received online. So they had people like the US Marines using it. The US Secretary of State announced that this was the main platform through which you could get information. So there were other international organizations that were relying upon this volunteer-driven collection of data. So the lawyers that were consulted said that consent was implied vis-a-vis the publishing of personal identifying information. So during the project itself, some of the SMSs were published. However, afterwards they were taken down, and this was I think it's still a bit of a thorny issue as to whether it should have been or not, but they couldn't be completely sure that there wasn't any harm being done to the communities in question, which is why they took it down. The reason I like this story is because as a result of that, because they spent these 24 hours in a really crucial time-pressured environment considering what they should do, and then they realized that there was a need for a code of conduct or a set of guidelines to advise people on what they should do, so for future reference. So after this, the SMS code of conduct for disaster response was drawn up as a result of their realizing that they had this data and they didn't know what to do with it. So this was a crowd-sourced, drawing upon expertise from loads and loads of experts, and it's now used quite widely within the crisis mapping community and iterated upon, as a result of what happened in Haiti.
So now we get into a slightly different area. We chose to talk about human trafficking because this presents a really kind of edge example where you deal with vulnerable populations that have very personal data that can bring them into harm's way. And they are also people who tend to be displaced and may need a service at a certain time, but would want to, at some point after they've been displaced, come back to where their original country of origin was. And so the great challenge with human trafficking is to create a system that allows for people to receive care when they need it, and thus requires for them to be identified in certain ways, but then also allows for them to step out of that and not be stamped a certain way for the rest of their life as someone who was a victim of slavery of some sort. And so in this world, NGOs and various intermediaries have been hard at work for the last 10 years trying to come up with a code of ethics that makes sense for this field of work. These types of NGOs face the same challenges as anyone doing this type of work, where they must report back to funders and government agencies who want to see that progress has been made. In addition to those players, often a case will end up in court around slavery, and in that case, the local law enforcement will want to get involved, and in order to bring this to court, you will need certain types of information. So in this case, the people doing this work are faced with a difficult set of considerations where they want to provide care and represent actual help. On the other hand, they are still obligated to collect information, and they themselves are actually curious about how that information can be used to map trends around the world, for example. And so what has happened is that these groups have been spending a very long period of time in the do no harm sort of brainstorm privacy impact assessment before they begin any sort of care program. And within that, they hone in on the indicators, as this is called in development. The indicators are forms of information that they feel are most essential in order to track who they're actually helping and report back to people outside. So they have become much smarter about their indicators, and this has allowed them to collect both the really, truly necessary information while following the data minimization principles that often are missed in this field. So a lot of what has been used to help them come up with this framework has been helped along by the EU Data Protection Directive, specifically around how sensitive data is handled for ethnicities. In most normal circumstances, it's actually not okay to collect information about religious and philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, political opinions, ethnic origin. This is all considered off limits in the standard practices within the EU Data Protection Directive. Of course, some exceptions have been made, and this is that if a data subject has given their explicit consent that they understand what it means to have certain pieces of information collected about them, and also that they understand what will happen to it down the line. Another exception is if if there are some sort of legal obligations involved, either with law enforcement, then there are some loopholes in there. As well, when the vital interests of the data subject are presupposed to be in danger, in which you can argue fairly easily in a case like data trafficking, then this is also grounds for exception. So in any case, this is a case where a long framework with lots and lots of clauses has actually ended up being practical and at least something to start from.
Okay, so now we come to our ways forward, kind of drawn between things that have already been mentioned within the international development community, things that are being worked on at the moment, and recommendations from the privacy community. This is, you might recognize this from the British sitcom Little Britain. Computer says no. We need to make sure that we're not building systems where computer says no puts people's livelihoods at risk. There are some examples of how biometrics data has been used, and there's such blind faith put in the system and put in the fact that this technology will be 100% correct all the time, that no matter if someone says, so for example, it's used when people are crossing borders to check whether they're crossing more than once to get double the amount of kind of the repatriation package that they might be offered from refugee agencies. And the systems some of the projects that have been developed so far mean that if a refugee crosses for the first time, genuinely for the first time, but their iris is somehow, there's a false match within the system, they don't get to have that cash repatriation package because the aid workers that are operating that technology have really such a lot of faith in the technology, and there's some amazing quotes from people who are operating it saying, now the machines can never be wrong, now we know who to trust, which is also a little bit scary. Being aware of the third-party risks and what this means. So, for example, with the example of the Syrian refugees having their data shared with banks in Jordan, being aware of what the environment is in which this is being shared.
And also, especially being aware now, there is a trend currently where more and more players are getting into the big data game, which means at some point that they will be sharing or receiving certain parts of a database from someone else that potentially held personally identifiable or sensitive information. So really hashing out what it means for a third party on the outside to be either sharing now or receiving that data becomes crucially important.
Yeah. And I guess another part of the people who are, so when you're designing a project that's using technology, making sure that there's a backup in case the project goes wrong. So the example that I just mentioned, iris scans were taken from refugees, but they weren't taken with any other backup, with any other data points. And this was done in theory with the privacy concerns of the refugee in mind. But it meant that if there was a false match, they had nothing to fall back on. So it was all reliant on this machinery being completely 100% right all the time.
So now we get to this issue of what data collection looks like if we are putting much more time into thinking through the ethical ramifications. So this involves, of course, the awareness of the long-term and downstream effects of the initial point at which the data was taken from someone. Of course, this also means data minimization as a basic principle. In order to do data minimization, that's not something you can do after you've collected the data, actually. That is a consideration that needs to be present in the design of the entire research or program or aid initiative from the very beginning and from beforehand, because data minimization doesn't mean taking a database and shaving off part of it. It means actually deciding that less data will go in the first place, but that data will be more valuable to begin with. One other huge issue that comes up, especially around big data, is oftentimes a body will claim that, oh, we are using anonymized data, it has been de-identified, and therefore we are taking precautions, and therefore there is nothing to worry about. It has been proven over and over in experiments and statistical calculations that re-identifying something that was anonymized to begin with is really not that hard, and this is something that we will hopefully see more examples of so that we can point out the fact that just anonymization is not enough.
And it's probably worth mentioning within the ICT4D movement, lots of funders do require lots of indicators to show how successful the project was. And in some cases, the information that they require to be collected might not necessarily be in the best interests of the population at heart. So that's something to think about again in the project design. Why are you collecting this information, and who is it benefiting, and is it actually doing any active harm, or could it do harm in the future to these already very vulnerable people?
So yes, a general guiding principle is building for unforeseen circumstances and consequences. What can you do now with the anticipation that the reason you thought you were collecting the data now is only one reason or one purpose or use for the data? Currently, the internet industry runs on the premise that we will always find a new use for one piece of data that seemed to only serve one purpose, and therefore we should keep the horizon open in order to see all the different uses for it. On the other hand, if we keep this usage open in this way, then we can get into some really problematic areas.
And then I guess this is kind of based on what my work is kind of around. So a movement away from traditional international development in the way I've been describing, of the kind of development actors parachuting into communities, carrying out a development project without that much input from communities affected, and then leaving. towards open development. And this is a more inclusive way of thinking about development projects. So it's building upon, it's a new framing of development projects, essentially. It's framing projects based on building upon local knowledge, including much more inclusive processes of going to communities and asking, what do they need? How can this happen in the best way for this particular community? It's getting rid of the one model for all, so there's not going to be, projects that are rolled out across countries regardless of their local cultures or customs. It's participatory forms, for example, participatory budgeting, community meetings that decide upon the priorities of the project in question. So it's using data not just data, but the processes around international development in a more open and participatory manner.
And the hope is that by making it more participatory, you are actually opening more room for people to provide you with active, informed, explicit consent when they do then decide to enter into a relationship that they become a data subject.
And finally, so throughout all of this, the people that we've been speaking to, I've been kind of astonished at the fact that they receive so much training, the humanitarian workers. They receive so much training before they go out into the field on how they should behave, what they should do, what they shouldn't do. And I haven't found a single person who's received any training on digital security or on data literacy or on what data might mean. They're told, this is being carried out in a secure way. And that's it. Like, it's being kind of pushed to the tech person on that project, and entire trust is being put into the fact that will be managed, and that has been managed in an inappropriate way.
Yeah, and this whole concept of whether something is secure or not is in itself false, because there are always degrees to which you can depend upon the fact that a piece of information has been protected correctly. And aside from what we might label hardcore digital security, which is whether something was encrypted in the correct way, there are also all of the information practices of people out in the field which influence how the data will be used. So if someone is out in the field and they are collecting certain types of data, but then they don't understand that a certain type of thing that they're collecting can be harmful down the line for a particular reason, that itself can be part of what you consider an information security practice.
Yeah, and then on the other side is the communities from whom the data is being taken. Obviously, it's kind of unrealistic to expect really vulnerable communities who might be in the worst of situations in the entire world, to expect them to take data use and data literacy as a priority when they clearly have others. But there are intermediaries within those communities that could be educated to know enough to ask the right questions, like other civil society organizations working in those countries, like journalists, that could learn about data literacy, so understanding what the data means together with the context. So if they see all these data sets, they would know, hey, that's not right that you're collecting data on ethnicities of populations, for example, or be able to contextualize it appropriately to hold donor agencies or the people carrying out these projects to account. And then, as we said, digital security training for people who are working with vulnerable communities and those who are in charge of using technologies. Thanks.
That's it.
Do we have time for questions? Yeah. Okay. Are there any questions?
When you guys talk about active consent in terms of how people use each other's data, I get kind of confused, because the truth of the matter is, when you collect data sets, more often than not, you don't know when it's going to be valuable. But oftentimes it becomes valuable at a later date, like you guys have said. I've heard of processes like data consent protocols, where in context, when they feel like they have the data and they feel like it could be appropriately used, they request for people to consent, to sign off and give consent to use that data. While that process works in very civilized, not necessarily civilized societies, but very Western societies, it doesn't work everywhere. I don't know, how would you solve this problem when you know that you eventually will need that data, when you know you eventually will have the appropriate context for it? Do you base it on people requesting to use the data, or do you base that on we're only going to collect this because we see this as appropriate now? That causes two problems, because if you collect from the bottom up instead of from the top down, you miss a lot of things that will become valuable in the future. But if you collect from the top down and not from the bottom up, you neglect a lot of societal issues.
Yeah, and of course, there's no easy answer to that. I think you're asking all the right questions. I would wonder if you can tell now that you don't need this data at this moment, but that you will in the future, then I assume if you can tell that now, then the collection of that data fits within some mission that you're working under. Whatever this greater premise for the work is would then carry over if you're already able to anticipate that you'll need something in the future. And so in that case, you would want to evaluate this along the priorities of the program in place for the data collection, while continuing to be aware that you are now opening up this road to unintended uses in the future.
Yes, but unfortunately, when you trim your data from a collection point, you limit its ability to work in conjunction with other data sets that other companies have collected. Because data does not work particularly well singularly, but it works incredibly well in conjunction with other data sets. And if you trim one data set and another person trims his data set, or starts by only collecting certain points, it loses its malleability to be applied in real-world situations. I think requesting the data, as a major company, requesting using specific data sets and asking each specific company, do you have a particular data set on this? Do you have a particular data set on this? And then requesting these data, and all of these companies then send out consent requests to the users of that data. And if these users give consent, they can use that appropriate portion of the users who gave consent on that data in the first place. This isn't a perfect answer to the question, but I feel like trimming data to begin with is not the appropriate way to go. I feel like contextually applying the data is the right way to go.
I think you're making, as you said, you're making a lot of assumptions that you can go back to these users and you can ask them that kind of thing. So we had a quote up earlier from someone that I spoke to who's been working a lot in Syrian refugee camps in Jordan with Syrian refugees. And he's worked in a lot of countries, and he said the one thing that struck him is the different way in which the same agency or the same organization will carry out procedures in different countries. So when they come to the UK or the US or Europe or somewhere, they have to follow a certain number of regulations. They have to make sure that the person they're collecting the data from understands what the data will be used for, how they can access it, how they can delete it, and lots of other considerations. Whereas when it's carried out, for example, in these refugee camps or in other development projects, they skip that entire process out. So the assumptions that you're making that you could go and you could request again, that kind of thing, you could request consent from people. Consider the environments in which people are working, the fact that people are moving. There's huge populations that they might not have ever been explained the process. They might have just been told, we need to have this and this and this, and then you can have these benefits. And that no one is going to say no. It's not a fair kind of consent procedure. But there are some examples of how information campaigns have happened around communities. So they'll get to the community together, they'll work with the community leaders already to explain what consent means to them in a way that they understand, rather than people who are in positions of power, by definition, explaining in a way that people might not understand so well.
Thank you. I'm sorry for being really finicky and asking a lot of questions, but I feel like if we take a one-sided approach where we only try to appropriate for the people using the data and not for the people giving the data, it causes problems. So maybe in the future, when we have the ability and we have this many people online giving this information, we can teach them what their data means. Maybe as far from the ground up, teaching people what their data means and making better systems in which they do give consent or do choose to not give consent.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question.
Thank you. I think we're also making a very fundamental assumption here, and that is that there is a we that collects this data, and that there is a they that maybe at most give us consent. So why are we not even considering systems where they own the data, where we create systems, or they create systems, or we create systems together, that then give the tools to them as well? So why is there a we who are operating on this? And then if we come up with new uses, we can just extend that free and open system that they have, and they can choose whether or not to run that intelligence on their own data.
Yeah, this is kind of what I was talking about with open development, making this whole system a lot less hierarchical and more participatory. So people design their own systems, they own what they're doing, they design their projects themselves, and they know what they need to do it. So
in other words, what I would call independent technology.
Perhaps. Or open development, as we like to call it. But yeah. Okay. I think that's it for questions. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, everyone.